not just so much of the developed world, but the American population has been clamoring for action. In fact, support for, say, the Kyoto Protocol is so overwhelming that a majority of Bush voters thought that he supported it because it's such an obvious thing to support. But there's a huge gap in the United States between public policy and public opinion, not just on this issue, a huge range of issues. So public opinion is pretty much excluded from influence on policy. As a result, even the very strong support for the public does not enter into policy choices on this or other issues. As far as the Bush administration is concerned, their position is the familiar one of corporate executives, which is the sector of the population that they represent in effect. If you're a CEO of a corporation, you don't pay much attention to what's going to happen 5 years from now. You pay attention to the bottom line in the next quarter. That's going to determine your salary, your prestige, the power of your corporation, and so on. If it turns out that the world is going to collapse 5 years from now, that's somebody else's business. Governments reflect the interests of their populations, and people, of course, would like a world for their grandchildren to live in, so therefore they have different points of view. But the very same individual, as a state manager and as a human being, may make very different choices. You can see this when people drop out of office and they come at the world from a different point of view. There are many such conflicts. I mean, even though the government is extremely closely linked to major corporations, in particular energy corporations, so the Bush administration practically comes out of the energy sector, even though there's a very tight linkage, there are conflicts, striking conflicts, when the same individual, say Dick Cheney, is representing corporate interests or state interests. And sometimes it's almost comical. Just to give a minor example, we'll take a major example which illustrates it. Take an impending war with Iran. Corporations aren't in favor of it. The population is overwhelmingly opposed. The energy corporations would be pleased to enter into Iran and exploit its oil resources. But the U.S. government won't allow them. Because it has a state interest. The state interest goes back to the standard mafia style of international affairs. The godfather does not accept disobedience, has to be punished. And in 1979, Iran was disobedient. They overthrew a U.S.-imposed tyrant who was a centerpiece of U.S. power in the region. And what's more, they even put some American hostages, diplomats, in prison. So therefore, all of U.S.-Iranian history, which was horrible, is eliminated, and we got to punish the Iranians for that. The U.S. immediately started supporting Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, went on with harsh sanctions, and the energy corporations can't break through that, even though the administration comes straight from that sector. In fact, there are even more dramatic cases. Take, say, Cuba. The U.S. has been punishing Cuba for Cubans, not Cuba, people of Cuba, for 45 years because of what internal documents call successful defiance. They're successful defiance of U.S. policies going back to the Monroe Doctrine. The Godfather does not accept that. Successful defiance is intolerable. The people have to be punished to ensure that they overthrow the government that is defying the master. The population of the United States, large majorities, want to establish diplomatic relations with Cuba, end the embargo, end the terror, and so on and so forth. It's been true for decades. A lot of the business world wants to do the same thing. They see market opportunities. And particularly interesting is the oil companies. Texas oil companies, George Bush's background. The Texas oil companies want to exploit offshore Cuban oil. U.S. government, which comes right out of that sector, won't allow them to do it. Sometimes it reaches comic proportions. About a year ago, there was a meeting in Mexico between Cuban energy officials and Texas oil company executives, including some of the bigger ones like ExxonMobil. Washington discovered that it was being held in a Sheraton hotel, which is owned in the United States, and they ordered the hotel to throw them out. Now, here you have George Bush and his friends coming out of the Texas oil industry. You have their friends, the Texas oil industry, trying to reduce U.S. dependency on foreign oil by exploiting close oil. But in his capacity, or whoever makes the decisions, in their capacity as state executives, the U.S. is perfectly willing to shoot themselves in the foot to prevent use of oil nearby, to harm their constituency in order to ensure that successful defiance will not be tolerated. Now, any mafia don will understand this, and those kinds of conflicts exist. In the case of the global warming, for the real constituency of the Bush administration, energy corporations, multinationals, and so on, they don't care that much what happens in their capacity in those institutions. It doesn't matter if their grandchildren don't have a world to live in. Of course, when they go home, it does matter. But people act differently in institutional frameworks. He's correct, but it's far more general. Take, say, lead. It was known that lead was poisonous by the early 1920s. It took 50 years in the United States before you could get some legislation to protect children from dying from lead poisoning. It was known. You know, the facts were known. The companies were keeping a lot of it secret, but most of it was known. 50 years. Take tobacco. Well, it's never been technically criminalized, but there are now measures, administrative measures, which make it difficult for children to smoke. It's been known for decades that tobacco is far more lethal than hard drugs, incomparably more lethal. But you know, the major corporations and the media, which go along with them, have held it back. Take, say, Europe. I read recently in an article, a book by Noam Chomsky, a British journalist, that the European Union subsidy for tobacco industries is greater than the amount of money the European Union provides for alternative crops for people growing coca. That's supposed to be one of the ways to stop drug production, provide them with alternative crops. They get less money for that than the British tobacco companies and the others get for poisoning people at a level far beyond that of hard drugs. Well, you know, those are the short-term calculations of people whose institutional role is to maximize profit, market share, and power. Whatever they may think, you know, move outside, they may be the nicest people in the world. And I remember once when the butcher of Lyon was captured, Klaus Barbie, finally captured, and he had worked for the Nazis, and then the Americans picked him up. He was doing exactly the same work for the Americans, and they finally spirited him off to Latin America. It was becoming embarrassing. But he was finally picked up. He was taken to France. He was going to be tried. And I happened to be listening to the, I think it was probably National Public Radio, had an interview with his daughter. She said she didn't believe any of the charges against him because he was the nicest father in the world, and he was very loving and took care of everybody and a sweet guy and so on, which I think is probably perfectly true. You can be one thing at home, and you can be something else in an institutional role. You can be destroying the world in your institutional role, consciously, and loving your children at home. Case after case of poison, destruction, and so on has this property. The same is true of what you began with, apocalypse soon, which was not my phrase, it was Robert McNamara's. Sober, serious analysts warn of apocalypse soon. It is correct. We know, see, unlike climate change, which we may be past the point where we can solve it, or maybe mitigate it, but something bad's going to happen. In the case of nuclear war, which is far more dangerous, I mean, that's terminates the species. We know what to do, how to solve it. I mean, it's not a mystery. The solution is understood, but it's just not interesting. So we'll take the chance of, serious chance of apocalypse soon, or Armageddon of our own making, as Senator Sam Nunn put it, because it's more important to be able to shake our fist at people. If you take an economics course, they teach you that a market, consumer market, is based on informed consumers making